Welcome. We'll have a bit of a, we can close our laptops out, we don't need that right now. We will have a bit of a recap of our second test, which was called Polynomials. So just to recap, what are polynomials? They are equations of the form x to the power of n. So a linear equation is a polynomial. We have y equals mx plus c, that's x to the power of 1. We have quadratics, ax squared plus bx plus c, and then we have cubics, quartics, and you can just keep going, adding degrees to polynomial. That's what polynomials are. Okay, so that's what our test was on. It was predominantly on chapter 2, and then with a little bit of focus on chapter 4. I would say probably 2/3 of the content were explored in chapter 2. Now in chapter 2, it is about quadratics, and we did a big recap of a lot of stuff you did in year 10. That's when you begin to get some exposure to it. And then we took things a little bit further. We focused on discriminant, where functions meet, and some pretty complex problem solving. So what I encourage you to do, pull your textbook out, have a flick through with me as well. This is when I first printed the notes for you guys. So I printed the notes after a couple of lessons. So you should have a notes book about polynomials somewhere in your math stuff. So we start with solving quadratic equations. Now when you have a quadratic, there are 3 ways it can be solved and 3 ways that we can express them as well. So when we have a quadratic, we can factorize it, okay, by using the cross method. So I hope we're really proficient with that skill, important skill, one we're going to need. We can complete the square, okay, or we can use quadratic formula. I remember being, in year 11 and just like quadratic formula all the time, just generates a solution regardless. You don't even have to think about it. It's an algorithm. Put the numbers in and it'll pop out the solution for you. But it's important to be competent with all 3. Okay, so they're the 3 ways we can solve a quadratic. I suppose you could say you can use your calculator as well, although that's not an explicit methodological process. These 3 are. Okay, and then I've said there's 3 ways we can represent a quadratic as well. We could have x take p times x take q. This is what we call linear factors, all right? And the beauty of that is that it's going to tell us the roots of the quadratic. We could have x take h squared plus k. That tells us the vertex, the turning point. Or we could even just have general form ax squared plus bx plus c, okay? So, if you expand that one, or if you expand this one and collect like terms, you're going to get general form of a quadratic. So what does this one tell you? It tells you the y-intercept. What does this one tell you? It tells you the vertex. And this one tells you the roots. So they can all tell you something different. They can all be equal to one another. And they're all the same quadratic, all describing the same graph. Different ways of describing the same thing. Okay? Cool. So let's go through. So we've got solving quadratics. So into A.1, you were doing factorising. Into A.2, you're doing completing the square. And into A.3, you're doing quadratic formula. Okay, 2b introduces you to discriminant. So remember in quadratic formula, you have, that's the quadratic formula. That's going to tell you the roots for any quadratic. Now this thing in here, b squared take 4ac, that's what we call the discriminant. We use a triangle to represent the discriminant. And that we have 3 things, right? If the discriminant is positive, so if this is a positive number in here, we're doing the square root of a positive number, there's always going to be 2 answers. Okay, so if the discriminant is greater than 0, we have 2 solutions. If the discriminant is 0, okay, if you have a 0 in there, then you're doing the square root of 0, which is nothing. So you're not plus or minusing anything, you've just got minus b on 2a. You only have 1 solution. And in the circumstance where the discriminant is negative, okay, you've got the square root of a negative number, math error, can't do it, no solutions. Okay, so that's what we learnt about in 2b. And we'll just jump back really quickly. We know with this a out the front, if a is positive, we've got a happy face, and if a is negative, we've got a sad face. That can tell us the direction, whether it's opening upwards or opening downwards for our quadratic. Okay, 2c, we only did a couple of questions from. We didn't test it, it's just curriculum wants us to cover it. So that's sum and product of roots. 2D is all about graphs of a quadratic function. Okay, so here I've got the three sort of ways we can represent a function. And when we're doing graphs, okay, we could be given the roots and the y-intercept. Okay, so for instance, let's say -1, 3, and you can find the equation from that. X plus 1, x take 3. Okay, they're the linear factors, we get that from the roots. Or we might even have like a vertex. Okay, this coordinate here, let's say 3, 4. You know, that one would be sum a times x take 3 squared plus 4. All right, so they're the sort of ways of looking at graphing. If it comes in general form and you need to graph it, that's where we look at factorising it, finding all that information. You're going to have your calculator for the exam. Use your calculator to support you. Okay, so that's all of D, and D is broken up into 4 parts, so I'm going to glide over to D there. We'll jump to 2E. In 2E, you're doing the reverse. You're starting with a graph and finding the equation of it. A bit like what I'm talking about here, really. So 2D and E I'll sort of talk about in one. Okay, in 2F, we're talking about when functions meet one another. So if you have a look, I'll just zoom in here. We looked just at quadratics meeting lines. Okay, so a quadratic is going to meet a line when they're equal to one another. You make them equal to one another, and you solve for the values of x. There's 3 possible circumstances. Either they cut, like the line cuts the quadratic twice. Either it touches it, in which case, what's the special word we use? Tangent. Okay, the line is tangent to the curve, or it misses it completely, in which case there's no solutions. So that's what we did in F, and you get some reasonably complex problems in there, like particularly when they want you to say, for what values of M, where is it? Exercise 2F. For what values of M are there, you know, is there 2 solutions? That kind of thing. Like some of these later ones, question 4 and 5 and that. Okay, in G, we get into problem solving. Now the hardest part about problem solving is generating the equation, isn't it? Okay, so it's normally these questions are sort of broken up into 3 parts. Part 1 says, show that the equation is this. So that's where you need to make an argument saying why they've developed some certain equation. And then it will say find the solutions to the equation. Okay, so you can always do part B and C, even if you can't get part A. And that's where particularly we should be using our calculator to help us out a bit, either in polynomial solver or graphing the solutions to G solver. In H, it's very similar to G in that it's like sort of practical applications of quadratics. It's optimization. Now, optimization means we are finding the optimal solution. That's the best, the most economic solution to some given problem. Okay, and so that's where you're using the vertex of a quadratic minus b on 2a is going to tell you the x coordinate of a maximum or minimum point. Okay, so that's where you're using that formula. So that's in H, and then we jumped over to chapter 4. We didn't do all of 4, we did a bit of it. So, for instance, 4a is just an introduction to it. We did some of 4a. Nope. We did 4b. Or 4a.2. Here we go, we did some of that. Because here it introduces you to the idea of polynomial equality. So, on the left, what's on the left equals what's on the right. We can equate the coefficients of each term. Okay? So if you've got 4x to the 3 equals ax to the 3, then a is 4, like in that one there. Okay, next page. So I encouraged people if they had extra time to do some more of this, but we didn't do all of it. We did some of 4a.2, and we did some of 4c here as well. If x plus 5 is a factor, okay, it means x plus 5 times by some general quadratic, ax squared plus bx plus c, will give you that cubic there. So that's what we're doing in polynomials, you know, and we had those big questions that was like, sort of like a 7-mark question that said, although we divided it up into a number of parts, but it said, find a, b, c, fully factorise, and then graph it. And all of that, you can really use your calculator to support you with those ones there, because you could just jump straight to your graph and work backwards. Then in E and F, we did them together because they really flow on from one another. We're looking at the graphs of cubic functions, finding the equations of them, and F is our quartic functions. Okay. So we know if it just cuts it once, it's a linear factor. If it touches it, it's a squared factor. If it has a flat cut, it's a cubed factor, etc. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm just working on an email at the moment. I'm sending to you guys just a list of everything I've sent to you. So there's like probably close to 10 attachments now to the assessment task on sector. So what I've got for you today is this one here. I'll pass this out. Polynomials exam revision. So yesterday we were doing functions and relations. Today we're focusing on polynomials and just polynomials. I reckon my advice would be to have a look over your notes, okay? Familiarise yourself with the content we went through, and then have a go at some of this stuff here. So what resources? I've given you 3 resources so far, printed resources. So yesterday we were working on functions and relations revision. Today we're working on polynomials revision, and you also have a practice exam. I had a number of people request to me to attach our first 2 tests. So the test for functions and relations and the test for polynomials. They're both attached to the exam assessment task on sector, blank copies and work solutions. And if you want practice tests for any of them, they're attached to the previous assessment tasks as well. Cool, let's get into it.